a lifelong Nebraskan currently residing in Omaha. He holds a BA and an MA in anthropology from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, with over 40 years of experience as an archaeologist, most of which was spent at the Nebraska State Archaeology office. Rob Bozell retired at the end of 2021. Despite his retirement, he continues to offer his expertise as a consultant on various research and historic preservation projects in Nebraska and neighboring states. His professional interests encompass past foodways, fur trade archaeology, and collaborating with indigenous tribes on repatriation and historic preservation efforts. Please welcome Rob Bozell.
Thank you very much. If you can't hear me, there is a mic. I'll be happy to put it on. You guys let me know. If you're okay with that? Yeah. As she said, I retired 3 years ago, so don't ask me any questions about controversies in history of Nebraska. I don't want to hear about it. Really glad to be here. Taylor King back there is, I think, kind of got me roped into this. He's going to be portraying his fifth great grandfather's big elk tonight, right?
Correct.
And for some reason, kind of wanted to have a little bit of background about what I like to think of as deep history, deep indigenous history. I think we all know a lot about sort of the 1800s and the 1900s, but a lot of people I found out through my career don't know a lot about sort of how long people have been here, who they were, who they're related to, what their life is like. So that's what I want to talk about. In terms of, and the reason I did the subtitle, Who Lived Here in 1491, somebody actually asked me that question one time. Okay, when Columbus came, there were Indians here, but who was here right before that? Was it caveman? Was it prehistoric man? Was it paleo man? Were it, Neanderthals? No, to all of that. So I want to really kind of address that because I think it's, you don't learn a lot about that in history, kind of a deep history of Nebraska and North America. So that's why I had to, who lived here in 1491. I think, I've been giving talks like this for a long time, and I always start out with asking the audience, how long have people lived in Nebraska? The voice changed. Take a couple guesses. Who wants to tell me how long have people lived in Nebraska? No guesses?
2,000 years.
16,000, 20,000 years.
Probably, yeah. 10 years ago, 12,000 years ago was the limit. There's been a lot of discoveries in not necessarily Nebraska, but in surrounding states and around North America, which is pushing that back to 18 to 20,000 years ago. Just to give you a little bit of perspective on that, if you think about the written record, like from the 1700s on, in terms of 18, it's just that little red thing. An analogy somebody told me is if you think about written history and human history in Nebraska being your whole arm, just your fingertip is written history. So from your fingertip back to your scapula, an archaeologist showing off. All that we know is from archaeology and indigenous oral tradition. Okay? So and there's a lot of challenges with both of those things. There's a lot we still have, there's a lot we don't know. And one thing that's kind of fun about working with archaeology and oral tradition is sometimes they actually match. A lot of times they don't. They don't correlate, but sometimes they do. And having, there's been a real not a resurgence, but a lot more inclusion of indigenous archaeologists and historians and oral tradition folks in the last 10 or 15 years, which has made it's made it richer for both archaeology and for oral tradition to kind of look at some of this information and see where it matches. It's, we're never going to have all the answers, but I think you get closer to the answers. So, anyway, so when I did this slide, it was probably 10 years ago, it was 13,000 years. Now it's back to 15 or 18. For a long time, the theory was that around 13,000 years ago, there was a corridor, there was two big ice sheets, and for whatever climatic reason, there was kind of a corridor, ice-free corridor, where people could have come across from Asia and come down this corridor into the interior of North America. Of course, the first place they come is Nebraska. But that corridor didn't really open until about 13,000 years ago. So the thought was, well, there couldn't have been people here before then. But we're finding sites in Mexico, in New Mexico, even in the East. They're popping up all over. And it's almost undeniable that there were people here 18 to 20,000 years ago. They wouldn't have walked across that ice sheet, so they're probably coming down the coast, the Pacific coast. And then at some point moving inland, from California or wherever. And some of these old sites are even down in Mexico. So we're just barely starting to understand how long people have actually been here. It's a heck of a long time. There's a few people that have the idea that people might even come from Europe. It really hasn't gained much traction. There's really not much DNA evidence for that, of Europeans coming 15, 18, 20,000 years ago. But anyway, so it's a whole new world. I think that I want to talk, and what we know, because it's a lot of archaeology, there's not a lot of real early archaeology in Nebraska or elsewhere. There's only a few sites. So a lot of my talk's going to be about the last couple thousand years. But let's go through, the first 10 or 12,000 years in a few minutes, so pay attention. For at least, 8,000, maybe 15,000 years of indigenous history in Nebraska, people were pretty nomadic, which is one reason why we don't have a lot of information, because they're not building big villages, they're not growing corn, they're not large there may be a lot of people, but they're scattered in small groups. And that's the case for many thousands of years. Initially, when people arrived in Nebraska, they're hunting mammoths. There were still Ice Age fauna that are now extinct. Mammoths, mastodons, I think sloths. I'm not sure about horses and camels. They may have already become extinct. But there's these large Ice Age megafauna were still around when people arrived in North America. Lacena, Taylor. He had questions for me, but already had slides for him. So anyway, one of the sites in Nebraska that's really important, it's controversial, I'm not sure I buy it, is the Lacena Mammoth, which is in Frontier County. Yeah, Frontier County, on the shores of Medicine Creek Reservoir. There's a couple other sites like this. Nebraska is really known for mammoths in terms of paleontology. We don't have any dinosaurs, we've got a lot of elephants. And a friend of mine, Steve Holland, an archaeologist, still active, has always believed that people were here way before 12,000 years ago. And he's found some of these elephant skeletons, which, looking at the breakage patterns of the bones and the arrangement of the bones, has convinced himself that the only way that these bones are broken open is somebody with a big rock bashing them open. To either get marrow out of them, or maybe they were taking, bone. They can make bone tools, bone chopping tools, tools that are made out of big, thick mammoth bone. And this is the excavation of Lacena. See, it's coming right out of the shoreline of Medicine Creek Reservoir. The problem with Lacena is that there's no stone tools, and certainly these people worldwide had stone tools, really robust stone tools. There's no stone tools, there's no fireplaces, there's no charcoal, there's just these broken up elephant bones. And I've always kind of thought, we just don't know enough about how bones get broken up. Elephants do weird stuff. I mean, even modern elephants, they sometimes go to where their dead comrades are, and they move things around, and they pick up stuff, and they make piles, they do weird stuff. And so it could have been that, a running herd of elephants that runs over some of their dead comrades could have been kicking these bones and breaking them open, and it looks like what would happen with a person with a big rock. Steve has all these, he's got arguments against all of them, and it's not worth going into, but I got to tell you that, 20 years ago I thought, I don't buy this. I think this is a natural event. Given the fact that there are, and this site is 18,000 years old. There's no dating, there's no doubt about that. It's got radiocarbon dates, it's 18,000 years old. But now that there are other sites of this age popping up in other parts of North America, I'm not quite willing to sort of buy it, but you know, I'm kind of thinking, yeah, maybe he's on something here. One reason that it's so hard to know about these really early indigenous people is a lot of these sites are really deep. This is there's an archaeologist down here in the 1930s. That's all windblown sediment. So these sites are hard to find. They're generally only found kind of fortuitously in construction or erosion or something, so there isn't that many. These people did also do a lot of, a little bit later, communal bison hunting. That's when you started to see small groups of hunters surrounding buffalo, a small herd of buffalo, or driving them off a cliff. And those create really spectacular archaeological sites. This is Hudson, Maine, up in Sioux County. Anybody ever been there? Okay. It's also got some controversy too, but it's where a bunch of buffalo died, whether they're killed by humans, or maybe butchered by humans, or scavenged by humans, or there may be multiple events. There's a lot of research to be done there. It's up in, I think in Sioux County, right? Northwest of Fort Robinson, maybe it's in Dallas County. So there's a really and so not only can you, when you can look at that and say, oh yeah, big deal, they killed a bunch of buffalo, we know that. Well, you can look at, are there males, females, juveniles, what parts of the animal are they taking away, how are they butchering it? There's a lot of questions that can be answered by looking at these, what they call bone beds. These early people made these spectacularly beautiful spear points. This is long before the bow and arrow. It's all spears and lances. A little bit later, like 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, you start seeing in Nebraska evidence of long-distance trade, and mostly it's in the form of marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific, where you're finding them in Nebraska. They didn't walk here. These are not fossils. These are trade items. So there's some really broad connections between people. That starts around 5,000 years ago. One thing that's Nebraska is known for, what butte is that, Vicki? Signal Butte. I like to pick on people. It's Signal Butte, yeah, south of Gary and stuff, kind of in the Mountain Hills. Those buttes out there in the Panhandle, the North Platte Valley, they've all got archaeology on top of them. And they're about 4,000 or 5,000, 6,000 years old. They're big camps up there. And they're really spectacular sites. This picture is actually taken I think in the 20s. You see a field crew, cars parked there. Smithsonian worked there in the 20s. The other thing you start seeing, again, we're not talking about big villages and communities, but this is air photos, I'm sure drones now. This is Kimball County. Those circles are circles of rocks that, again, they didn't walk there. They were put there by people, and they're probably teepee rings, or what they call teepee rings, where they're anchored. They're using the rocks to anchor the outside of the teepee, kind of before they had iron, teepee stakes and that kind of thing. That's a close-up of one. These things are not very common in Nebraska, but when you get out in Montana and Alberta, you get big plateaus with hundreds and hundreds of these rings, and they seem to date as old as 4,000 or 5,000 years old. This is up on Lodgepole Creek between Kimball and the city somewhere.
Rob, I've got a question.
Yes, sir.
Because he gave me permission to ask questions.
Yeah. One. Go ahead.
TP rings, could those not be rock hinges?
Hinges for what, like ceremonial?
Ceremonial, measuring solar alignments.
There are
rising
definitely
stars.
stuff. There are
Like,
definitely.
put their TP right next to the other one.
Well,
There's no backyard there.
you're telling me. There certainly could be. There's a lot of stone features which are not. They're astronomical. The medicine wheel and stone lines and cairns. These are the ones that have been excavated, not in Nebraska, but a lot of them in Alberta and Montana. All have a fireplace in the middle of them. Right, a small, patch of burned earth and charcoal and ash, and a lot of, debris, flint debris from making and sharpening stone tools, like someone's living in them. You're right, we don't really know. That's the thing is we don't know. And there's a lot of stone alignments that have nothing to do with people living in them. The general theory is that these are domestic structures, but, who knows? the thing about archaeology is there's no one around to tell you. That's why he's okay. Now, what we know about in terms of indigenous Nebraska archaeology is really the last 1,500, 2,000 years. So that's what I want. And things, 2,000 years ago, things started to change really dramatically. And there's a lot more sites. And the one thing that happened about, well, certainly by 1,500, but 2,000 is when it started. Everybody know what I'm going to tell you? What happened? What they start doing? Yeah, farming. Corn, beans, squash. They're experimenting with that stuff as early as 2,000 years ago. And so, you know, whether agriculture, horticulture, they were certainly probably aware of this stuff, but whether there's an increasing population which required people to start producing food as opposed to just hunting it, or whether you know, a larger, you know, whether it's a chicken or egg, what came first? You know, the agriculture or the increasing population. They seem to came together, but there seems to be some kind of relationship, because certainly when you start seeing a lot of corn agriculture in Nebraska and other states, you get a lot more sites, archaeological sites, and thus probably a lot more people. And they're staying in places longer, and they're living in larger groups. A lot of them in Nebraska, certainly the eastern half of Nebraska, they're not living in little portable things like teepees or teepee rings. They're starting to build substantial houses. They're made of earth and timber and wattle and daub and sod. There's a lot of different variations, but they're called earth lodges, although some of them aren't true earth lodges. They're depending on what they're covered with. But this is an excavated one that I was involved in my first year of my career. Where the crew's standing in a big square thing, and these little circles, they showed up as dark circles, and anybody know what they are? Huh? Posts, yeah, the post holes. So where a post was in the ground, post rots, but because it's so organic, it leaves a little stain. And all those larger pits were storage and refuse pits. A lot of it to store corn in. Store, you know, so they're producing food and they're storing food, so there's greater population. And there's a fireplace in the middle, right there, right around the crew. These storage pits, when they started growing corn, sometimes they're huge. I mean, this is an archaeologist standing at the bottom of one. I mean, they're big, and particularly some of the later Omaha, Pawnee, Ponca ones, they probably have ladders to get down into them. So they're producing a tremendous amount of corn.
Where are those?
Where are they?
Yes.
They're in the lodges, like the mouths of them are in the lodges, sometimes they're outside.
Where?
What location in
The
Nebraska?
location?
All over eastern Nebraska.
Eastern
Thousands of them, mostly eastern. You get started kind of west of, you know, Kearney, North Platte, there's not as much agriculture, because there's not much rainfall. But yeah, real common along the Missouri, the lower Platte, Republican, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and they show up,
Along rivers more predominantly?
pardon me,
Along rivers more predominantly?
predominantly along rivers and creeks. Most of these villages are within a quarter mile of permanent water.
Right.
And they probably had the gardens down on the floodplains of these creeks and rivers, and they were living a little higher. You know, a floodplain's not a good place to live because it floods. That's the name floodplain. So they're living on terraces and ridges and bluffs overlooking these valleys, but using the valleys. So yeah, good question. And there's hundreds of these sites around. Okay, and some of these villages are fortified. Later ones, there's warfare, and some of them have these actual ditches around the village. This is an excavation of one of these ditches. So if somebody's attacking, you have to go kind of like European moats, down into the ditch and then up a bastion to attack. So, and sometimes these ditches are also used for trash disposal. See all those white things sticking out of the wall, that's all bison bone. It was just probably butchered bison bone that's thrown in there. This is a, whoever good art historians are, it's not Bodmer, Catlin maybe, I'm not sure. Anybody know who painted this? Probably 1830s. This is Fort Clark. A lot of my best illustrations are not from Nebraska, but they're analogous to Nebraska. This is Fort Clark, which is in North Dakota. I think it's Fort Clark. This is a Hidatsa or Mandan village. You can see this is the edge of it. See, these are all earth lodges, and they're living very closely together. So even though, well, this is a photograph. Some of you have probably seen this. Guy named William Henry Jackson lived at the Pawnee. Pawnee's last village was in Genoa, basically right into town of Genoa, like Columbus. And he took photographs of it. They're probably having a dance or some kind of ceremony in the central courtyard. These people are sitting on top of their lodges, clearly observing something going on there. This gives you a little bit of sense of what these villages look like as now archaeological sites. This is a low-level air photo. Also in North Dakota, but again, it's very analogous to the Omaha, Pawnee, Ponca, Udo villages in Nebraska. Each one of these circles is where one of those lodges were. When they built these lodges, they're not built right on the surface. They're sort of semi-pit houses. They dig them down a foot or two, a circle or a square, some are square, some are circular, and sort of a foundation. Then they put the posts around the inside of this sort of foundation they dug, and then cover it with earth and all that. So when these these villages are abandoned, and that wood and timber eventually kind of rots and collapses, and it'll leave a depression. It collapses in on itself. And this is one of the most, I just like this photo. This is at Knife River Indian Villages, which is a national park. Anybody been to Knife River, North Dakota? Yeah, it's pretty neat, right, Taylor? It's pretty impressive. It's mostly Mandan, Hidatsa, but it's analogous to what's going on down here. This one's really neat because you can also see the trails. Your trails coming in and out of the village. I think this is a fortified one. When you get settled, more of a settled life, and this is where a lot of this is sort of speculation, and this is something Taylor's been thinking a lot about and writing a lot about, is, when does sort of religion and ceremonialism come into play and why? Probably for many, many thousands of years, but you start seeing it in terms of something you can actually put your hands on and see, again, in this last couple thousand years. This is rock art. This is along the Nemaha in southern Nebraska. There are animals. There's clearly a fish right here. There seems to be human figures. There's a lot of star kind of things. I don't know, it looks like a star. There's, we don't have a lot of rock art in Nebraska, but there's a lot in Kansas, and there's a lot out west.
Is that an Indian cave?
No, there's hardly anything left of the Indian caves.
Oh.
There's only there's a turtle and a buffalo, and then there's a whole bunch of initials from the 1960s. That's actually near the Leary site. We'll get Lance to, we'll go there. It's near the mouth of the Nemaha, down in Richardson County. There's only 2 or 3 really good rock art panel sites that I know of in Nebraska. This is one of them, and there's another one on the Omaha Reservation in a place called Blackbird Canyon that has, it's probably Omaha, because it's got even a few depictions of people on horseback, but it's got dancers, it's got a lot. So you start seeing, archaeological evidence of understandings of cosmology and astronomy and religious. You can see it now. Not to say they weren't doing that 10 or 12,000 years ago, but now we have sort of evidence to interpret it. So you need to write a book on rock art too.
It's on the list.
Volume 2, Volume 3. Artifacts during this time period, also much more diversity, a lot sort of really well-made things. There's a stone knife and a bone handle, very thin stone butchering tools. those two white things are carved out of mussel shells, river clams. You know, they're clams in rivers, they're not in the sea. There's been several theories about what they are. Some people think they're ornaments, you know, just...
You should have worn the one that I gave you.
I should have brought the fishing pole you needed too. Somebody else also had a theory, it's not me, but I kind of like it, that they might even be fish lures. Somebody reconstructed one and then tied a string to like the eye hole and pulled it through water and it goes like this, like a fishing pole. I don't know. It looks like a lot of effort to put into for a fishing pole, so it probably is something. What do you think? I mean, what do you...
I think it was a clan symbol, something that adornment.
Yeah, yeah. They're there. Those are from, I think those are from around Omaha, Suffolk County.
Is the brown thing something different than the white ones?
Sorry. Yes, thank you. The brown thing is an actual, it's a carved out elk antler bracelet. Probably actually not a bracelet, but a bow guard
Okay.
is what they think it is, yeah. Oh, wrong direction. I want to go forward in time, back in time. Okay. A couple thousand years ago, pottery. That's anything that happens. Again, you know, getting clay and water and crushed rock and minerals and slapping it together and heating it up is probably not something that they didn't know how to do. They didn't need to. But when you had agriculture in large communities, you start to have different ways of cooking food, preparing food, storing food, you know, water. And pottery is interesting, archaeologists, because all this different kind of decoration on it, these lines, those mean things. And they mean things to the women who are making the pottery. They mean things to the family, you know, and those stuff, that's art, and it changes through time. And a lot of that decoration doesn't have any function, it's just art. And so when you excavate lots of archaeological sites and have lots of pottery, you can start to look at people moving around, and migrating, groups coming together and breaking apart, you know. And so I think, you know, most of the pottery is probably made by women. So, you know, you might have a situation, you know, where a fellow marries a woman from a different band, and she comes to live with them. And, you know, he said, well, here's how we make pottery. And she's like, no, not anymore. Make it this way now. And so you can start to see trace around migrations of people. And so they're really important, not just as art, but as a tool for looking at. And this thing, I always like to show, this fellow up here is neat. It's stone, about that big. It's carved stone. It's found in Webster County. Yep. And it may be a pipe at the top's broken off, but the thing that's interesting about that guy, it looks like he's wearing something on his head, right? Like a helmet. Okay, he probably is. There are things very much like that in the southeast, you know, Cahokia, Etowah, Georgia, even Mesoamerica. And what that is, it's they have these court games, ball players, and they have helmets. And so that is either a copy or a trade item from the southeast or maybe even Mesoamerica. Okay. Even though there are a lot of the archaeology is in the eastern half of Nebraska, and a lot of it's these agricultural villages, bison's still a huge deal. It's a huge deal. They're still going out into the sand hills in western Nebraska and Wyoming and going on these big bison hunts. Maybe once, twice a year where they might kill a lot of bison, you know, butcher them, dry the meat, meat's taken back to villages, and they can eat, you know, dried meat for a long time, you know, in addition to the corn and beans and squash. Some of these great pictures are not from Nebraska, but they're close. And I always think, I'll just say they're from Nebraska, but someone's going to bust me. So it's actually Wyoming. Wyoming's got all the cool stuff. But this is a site. It's actually a natural sinkhole, geologic sinkhole that people were driving bison into and then butchering them down there. It's hard to tell, but there's 17 different layers. Those are 17 separate events of a bison kill and butchering event. Yeah, and it's called the Boar site, and it's on the the Wyoming side of the Black Hills on I-90. There's a rest area nearby. You can actually walk. State of Wyoming is developing it into a historic site to visit. That's another thing. The Boar side, those are a bunch of bison skulls arranged in a circle, which may mean something. But the brain cavity's all been busted open. The target brain for high tanning. So when, I get asked a lot, well, what tribes are these? What tribe? I get the question, what tribe lives here? It's really kind of hard to tell much before the 1500s, 1600s to answer that question. But by 1700, you can start to identify based on oral tradition, based on early French accounts, based on a lot of stuff, who these people are. And in eastern Nebraska, there's several kind of primary players. The Pawnee, which have probably been here longer than anybody. It looks like if you asked, what group of indigenous group is really indigenous to Nebraska, Pawnees are probably going to win that argument. They've been here for probably at least 1,000 years, and maybe longer. So they're living in the Lower Loup Valley, Platte Valley, plus a group of them are living on the Republican and the Blue. Up on the mouth of the Niobrara, where the Poncas were. Omaha, probably all the way from beyond where the Poncas are down to Omaha. And then southeast Nebraska, mostly Odo, Missouri, and Iowa. Except for the Pawnee, a lot of these people came from the Midwest. Great Lakes, Iowa, Minnesota, upper Mississippi Valley, Ohio Valley. So we can see them archaeologically moving out here in the 1600s, 1700s, where the Pawnee may have been here before. This is always fun. We did some work a couple years ago on the sand hills on an Apache village. And I say, oh, we worked on an Apache village. People say, well, you're crazy because Apaches didn't live here. They live in New Mexico, and Geronimo and stuff. Yeah, they did. They actually did. And it's got kind of a unique story. Apaches and Navajos speak a language group called Athabascan. And the Athabascan speakers occur in two places, the Arctic and the Southwest. And so, probably 1,000 years ago, a bunch of these Athabascan speakers started moving down the Rockies and heading, and who knows where they thought they were heading, but they ended up in New Mexico as the Navajos and Apaches. But in the 1500s and 1600s, for some reason, they kind of got stuck in the Central Plains and lived all over western Nebraska, western Kansas, and a lot of the eastern Colorado. And they're Apaches. And when they got here, they started kind of doing what the Pawnees were doing. They were actually growing corn out in western Nebraska. We did an one out by Mullen a couple of summers ago, 5 summers ago, and found that they're also not really nomadic. They're building little villages. In fact, we did that with some ground penetrating radar that found these anomalies, which were circular. And we excavated across the middle of one, and sure enough, they're lodges. There's some kind of houses, and there's lots of burned timber. There was corn, a little bit of corn, are they earth lodges? Are they hogans? We don't really know, but they're permanent structures. So there was a couple hundred years, 1600s, 1700s, where western Nebraska was dominated by Apaches. People say, no, Apaches didn't live here. I say, come on. This is from that Apache site, and you got pottery. Their pottery looks a lot like Pawnee, okay? That's probably evidence of some kind of interaction. And they're either copying Pawnee or they're trading with Pawnee. But they're making stone tools and agricultural tools and hunting tools and all kinds of stuff. So it's funny, you see people move into an area, and they always kind of quickly adapt to whatever people are doing there. It's just like immigrants today. You want to take some of your culture that you bring with you, but you also want to assimilate into, to be an American, or for these guys to be a Pawnee. And so it's fun to look at this and look at this clearly interaction between different groups of people. And maybe not always friendly either. The Pawnees talk a lot about a group called the Paducah, which there's not a tribe called the Paducah anymore, but that they were sort of enemies with, there was some competition. We think they're probably talking about these folks. And I don't know, Ted, have you ever heard the word Paducah? What does it mean?
I don't know.
Somebody said it may be a Pawnee word, it may be an Omaha, because the Omahas were messing with these guys too. It may mean, just means enemy.
Yeah, it's used for the Comanche sometimes.
Sometimes it may just kind of mean enemy. So that's another Apache pot based on Pawnee pots. Okay. What about all these other people? Why do we not know anything about these really prominent tribes, particularly the Teton, Cheyenne, Arapaho, a little bit to the south, you got some Kiowa, Crows from the north, Comanche, you got a little bit of them in western Nebraska. There is virtually no archaeological, again, I'm an archaeologist, there's no archaeological record of these people. We know they're here from history, but we don't find any sites related to them. Or not very many, few, and there's not much there. And the reason is, it's a big difference between looking at the archaeology of nomadic people versus sedentary people. You know, you get these Pawnee and Omaha, Ponca, and they're living in these places. Those are like villages, sometimes occupied for 100 years. So you get, 1,000 people living someplace for, for 50, 100 years. You get a lot of artifacts. You get a lot of features like these lodge floors and fireplaces and bison bone beds, and where a lot of these equestrian nomadic groups were pretty mobile. And there may have been thousands of them, but they're spread out in little bands all over these vast areas, and they're probably not staying in any place for very long at a time. Therefore, they don't leave a really robust archaeological record. The other thing is, by the time a lot of these folks got here, they had pretty much abandoned stone tool technology, because when you're making stone tool, all these other people had, stone knives and arrowheads and choppers and scrapers, and in order to make and maintain them, you produce thousands and thousands and thousands of little pieces of flint from making and manufacturing and resharpening these tools. So when you go to an archaeological site, there's just tons of these bits of flint. By the time a lot of these folks got here, they were fully equipped with Euro-American, they had guns, knives, kettles, horses, and so you don't get a lot of that. Metal sometimes is less on the ground, it's going to rust away, So, whereas stone is a little more durable. So we just don't know a lot about them archaeologically. I think if you're interested in these groups, the best is their own oral traditions and a lot of history. A lot of history, particularly with Indian war. In the 1700s, you started getting contact between, initial contact was here with the French. Few explorers, French traders, trappers, are actually living in and among some of these eastern Nebraska tribes as early as the early 1700s. Anybody know what this is depicting? They know. Actually, probably closer to Columbus.
Columbus?
Yeah. Villasur, massacre of Villasur was a Spaniard.
Pawnees.
Right. Villasur came up out of New Mexico with a group of Spanish soldiers and some, I think, Navajo guides, right? I'm pretty sure Navajos. And because this was actually, in terms of colonialism, Spanish territory, even though they weren't really up here. But the French were here. And so I think, part of this depiction of this is that the Spaniards sent a contingent up into the Central Plains and say, what the heck's going on with all these French? This is our land. We don't want these French here. The French were already in a trade relationship with the Pawnees and the Odos, and they attacked them and killed most of them, probably around Columbus, Nebraska, is the guess, is where this happened, although we haven't found it. This, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm kind of making part of this up.
In Santa Fe, if you go there, there is a museum that has the copy.
Yes.
The real one.
The original. This is a copy that we made. There was a person, here's where I'm don't quite, a few of them survived and got back to New Mexico. And there was a guy who made a painting depiction of this. He stitched together, I think, 6 or 8 deer hides. This is just one panel of this battle. And it's actually, yeah, at the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe, the original. And this is where I'm not quite sure. I think that this hide painting was in a castle in Switzerland or something. Anybody heard this? Am I making this up? I continue to make it up. I think it was in a castle found in World War II. And they found a couple of these hide paintings and figured out what they were. I can't remember what the second one was, but the Swiss government or the Germans said, this belongs in New Mexico, and that's where it is. But anyway, so you know, colonialism, I could blabber on forever about that stuff, because it really is, I mean, it changed everything really dramatically. And, you know, I think in the 1700s, there might have been a short period where, you know, mostly the French here, you know, wanted bison robes, and they wanted beaver pelts, and they wanted all this stuff that they could get rich from by selling to the Americans in the East and the Europeans. And the tribes liked all this metal stuff, you know, the beads and the guns and the kettles. And so there was this really advantageous business relationship for a short period of time. And then things got really bad. And we know why. Mostly epidemic diseases. And when you look at some of those pictures I showed of those lodges, they're right next to each other. You get 1,000 people living in, you know, 100 earth lodges in such a confined quarter, and smallpox and cholera comes, and up to 90% mortality in some of these tribes up and down the Missouri River. They just decimated them. Cheyenne and Teton actually survived better because they were so spread out and so nomadic. They were hit hard, but not nearly as hard as these agricultural tribes, which, you know, that I think at one point estimates for Pawnee population are 20,000.
14 to 21.
Yeah, 14 to, you know, there were a lot. When they left Nebraska, 1,000?
1,400.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, that's well over 90% mortality. It just dramatically changed everything. And you know, social organization and material culture, you know, they switched to, you know, European-made goods, Indian schools, you know, it didn't bode well for the tribes, particularly these village tribes around here. Now, one thing about archaeology and our oral tradition is, you know, we can look at that process. We can look at what the archaeological record tells us of these people in the 1600s and the 1500s and 1,000 years ago, and then look at, you know, Pawnee's last village was at Genoa. They left 1873, something like that. You know, you can use archaeology and oral tradition, these tools, to look at, you know, patterns of culture change with events, or they're climatic events, and we've got some climatic events that we had to deal with in the past too, which I didn't talk about. But, you know, or introduction of new people, conflicts. So, you know, people, I think archaeology is just about finding cool stuff. It is. But it really is, what it's about is to take objects and be able to make some assumptions and tell a story about past human behavior, whether it's at an individual level or a group level. We as archaeologists want to take these objects and these lodge floors and these bison bone beds and all this stuff and figure out, you know, what happened. Because, as I said, 90+% of the time period of when humans lived in Nebraska, there's no photographs, there's no newspapers, there's no paintings, there's no recordings. It's all based on archaeology and oral tradition. And kind of back to my original about how long have people been here. I work with some, you know, native folks, indigenous folks, that, you know, that are more into oral tradition, and they say, you know, they talk to their elders and say, you know, how long have we been here? The answer a lot is forever. We've been here forever. I don't know if you hear that a lot in your research, you know?
Yes,
You know,
and then
and,
dramatic when I say everybody migrated.
well, and so, yeah, a lot of people say, well, then, you know, you had to come from somewhere. No, we came from here. That might be true. In fact, we keep finding older dates. Maybe we'll find out that they, you know, they really did. But anyway, so that's kind of what, you know, archaeology, you know, how we've tried to weave native traditions and really fill in that gap of these people that lived for at least 12,000 years here, because they have the right to have their story told too, I think. We don't know, because they're not here to tell us, you know, we want our story told, but, you know, that's the only way to go. And now, that's not your teacher, that's nothing to do with Nebraska. I'm just showing off. Anyway, any questions? I can elaborate on, but you know, that's kind of a summary of Nebraska Indigenous.
How many thousands, millions ago was this area covered with oceans, with water?
That's a really good, her question was how long ago was this area covered in an ocean, underwater, which it was. My understanding is Nebraska does not have any paleontological evidence of terrestrial dinosaurs. Brontosaurus, Stegosaurus, all of those dinosaurs you get in Wyoming and Colorado. The reason is because there was no land here, it was underwater. So,
Right.
so probably, and somebody if they know, feel free to correct me, I think, you know, 30, 40 million years ago, back to 100 million years ago, there was periods where there was this great inland sea. There was a great inland sea. And so the few dinosaur fossils, or, you know, the age of dinosaur period fossils we do have in Nebraska are swimming dinosaurs, plesiosaurs and mosasaurs. They're these big kind of Loch Ness monster looking kind of deals. But yeah, so there's no brontosaurus because it was all underwater. I think that was, you know, at least 60 million years ago. I'm not quite sure when they.
Older than I am.
Just a friend of mine, he's not here, so I'll tease him. He's talking about the sand hills. And he said, you know, the sand hills, that was all under water one time. And I said, yeah. And he goes, yeah, and if you look in our photo, you look at all these dunes, that's the configuration of this underground sea, which it's not. I think you're mixing two geologic stories. The sand hills are all formed by the wind. But, okay. Somebody, yes, sir.
Bring into today, what are the recognized tribes or nations in Nebraska today?
Living in Nebraska
Yes.
today, Omaha, Winnebago, Ponca, Santee, and the Iowa tribe and the Sagittarius tribe have little bits of land in southeast Nebraska. I got them? You might want to say, why haven't you talked about the Santee and Winnebagos? They're not even up there. They came 1860s? Yeah. The Santees were from Minnesota, the Winnebagos were from
Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, yeah. And during the reservation period when people were getting pushed all over, yeah, they wound up in Nebraska. So they
What
really,
was Sioux?
the Sioux,
Huh?
like the Lakota, the crazy horse, that, okay.
They were always further north, but they came out of the Great Lakes.
They came out of the Great Lakes too.
Go down to Canada?
And, well, you know, Great Lakes, upper, and what's interesting about the Sioux is they were, before they came out onto the plains, which was probably the 1700s, they were harvesting wild rice. They were also little villagers living in the Great Lakes area.
Right.
And got pushed out here. I think the story there is, you know, when you start getting, you know, the Europeans came and the Americans came, everybody's getting pushed westward. So the Sioux may not have been pushed out here by Europeans, but they were maybe pushed out here by other tribes.
Something happened.
Something's happened. Everybody's getting pushed westward. So yeah, the Cheyenne also are an upper Great Lakes tribe, I think, right? The Cheyennes also are from.
Are they Algonquin?
I think so, yeah. So, but recent, you know, I mean, relatively recent, 1700s. Yeah.
Any evidence of any of the mountain tribes that got pushed out here, east?
You know, that's a good question. There's a little bit of evidence in western Nebraska based on some pottery of things that kind of look Shoshonean or Crow. which are very similarly related. So a little bit, but not nearly as much. But yeah, there's some sites in, there was a guy, I remember a guy named Telford Ewing, lived out there in Scotts Bluff. He was a big collector. He had pottery, I think there was some at that museum, that was from Scotts Bluff that really looked like Shoshone and Crow pottery from Wyoming and Montana. So a little bit, but most of it's coming from the east, and it's from English, French, Americans, everybody get English whisper. Yeah.
How densely populated was America in, say, the Middle Ages compared to Europe and compared to other areas? Because we never talk about how many people lived over here. Was it close, or were we less dense?
I think it's really hard.
There's lots of different methodologies.
Yeah, it's, the thing about the Middle Ages in Europe, you kind of had written records. You had, with the church and the kings, and they were counting people. We don't know. I know that there around 1100 AD, 1200, there were big communities. The biggest is Cahokia, probably, right?
That's Noah, after that.
Yeah, where you had, again, you kind of got to base the population on lots of math. Some of those are probably 50,000 people, right?
Cahokia at the city center was 15 to 20,000,
Yeah.
and the outlying
And all these outlying communities.
150 to 200,000.
Yeah.
But that was the
But that was the biggest. So, I would imagine that,
Up here.
during the Middle Ages, all of North America, you probably had several million people.
all the research that I looked at, conservative believe is 1 million, and some of the estimates were up to 100 million, with the highest concentrations being in Mesoamerica. And all the technologies, LiDAR, et cetera, they're finding more evidence of some of these, Mayan communities and Mesoamerica and further stuff in the Amazon. And the bottom line is we don't know.
Yeah, we just don't know.
But smallpox, that was the big game changer. When you were looking at any of those agricultural communities with 85 to 95% decimation rates, I don't care how many people were there, it took that many.
Was that because of the white population coming in?
Smallpox was a variant of cowpox, which probably originated in the Netherlands. So, it definitely affected European populations, but those diseases were not known to populations here. And there were other things, right? Maybe the plague, there was...
Well, I don't, there may be other, it's hard to, you get back in time, there's a little bit of evidence, it's mostly kind of speculation. There may have been also pre-Columbian diseases, any kind of disease, disease vector. So there might have been some, but I think the whole smallpox, cholera, which were the two biggest ones that were absolutely introduced by Europeans, were the biggest, impact. And that, so yeah, they killed millions of people. Yeah. Yes?
Your slide showed most of the migration coming down from the north through the ice. Wasn't there any migration coming up from the south?
Well, not that we know of, but, there's, the best, at least the archaeological interpretation of indigenous people is they're related in the distant past to Asian people, okay? And then there's even DNA evidence of that, too. And so and you look at all the sites, they seem to be coming from the north, Eurasia, Siberia, across the Bering Strait. There are people who have speculated there may have been people crossing the oceans, though. There are some sites in South America that are kind of weird looking, that sort of look like, well, maybe there's some influence from Asia that people came across boats, but it'd be probably very little compared to the majority of people coming down the Pacific coast or through these ice corridors. Yeah. Now, once people are here, there probably is a lot of going back and forth. That's why we get, corn. Corn, I hate to put it to you, corn did not come from Nebraska. Corn came from Mexico. That's where it was first domesticated. It was a plant, I think called teosinte. It's a grass, yeah.
9,000.
Yeah, and so that's where people first started domesticating the little heads on this grass to turn into corn. So that idea, and probably some of those people, was coming out of Mexico down into the southwest and spread out onto the Midwestern plains and stuff. So yeah, there's interaction up and down.
Mr. Mr. Bozell, would you
Yes.
entertain a final question?
You can
or-
entertain as many questions as you want. Yeah, sure. Oh, no. Well, no, I think I'm done. Go ahead.
So, going back to oral stories of indigenous peoples,
Mhm.
at Pahoo, not too far
Yep.
outside of Fremont and
Yep.
Cedar Bluff,
Yep,
there are multiple accounts of stories about that being the navel of the earth.
okay.
And this goes back to the Pawnee stories that the Creator brought a flood to get rid of the giants. Is there any evidence of flooding? Mandans had those stories too.
I mean, there's certainly archaeological evidence and geologic evidence of lots of flooding
Because that would wipe things
on
out, right?
floodplains. I mean, you can see huge flood events on the, the Missouri Valley and but in terms of up off the floodplains, like the.
Well, that's where they took refuge.
Right,
Which
they
is
may
higher
have, but
up.
yeah, so, yeah, no, you've got, I mean, the Missouri River Valley, if you dug a big, huge backhoe trench, and geologists have, you just see 10,000 years of flood events and shifting rivers and, yeah. So, yes, there is a lot of evidence, but whether it's,
So you do believe in the giants?
you didn't ask me that. You didn't ask me that. I was waiting for that. Giants and stuff. What was that, 6, 7 years ago?
Yeah, we had a debate on
We
the
had a
Lust
debate
Hills.
on some archaeological speculation back in the early 1900s and oral tradition about giants and races of giants and little people and stuff. We had a
And I won.